Hello again, and welcome to this second of three videos accompanying the CWI and AIEB Continuous Professional Development Toolkit on Climate Justice. My name is Jamie Gorman, and in this video, we'll be looking at some key concepts and policy frameworks for climate justice. So I'm sharing my screen, and I hope that you can see my slides. And the concepts that we'll be looking at and the policy context mirrors what is set out in the toolkit. So if you have the toolkit to hand, you can follow what we're talking about here in this video. I think the first thing to say at the outset, of course, is that as community workers and youth workers, social professions, our role is not to be climate policy experts. Our role is to bring our expertise in community development, working with particular groups of people in society to support their participation, empowerment, and realization of their rights. We're bringing those skills to bear on the climate crisis and climate policy. So we are one group of professionals amongst many involved, and one group of people amongst many people involved in shaping climate policy. And the expertise that we bring is very valuable. We're not expected to be climate scientists or environmentalists. And, I think it's important just to emphasize that, because this field of environmental policy is vast. People spend their whole lifetime just working in that space, and there's a lot of technical terms and a lot of specialized language that is needed to deal with complex and technical issues. But as practitioners in community work, we don't need to be across all of that. And so I just want to encourage you to not be turned off by the technicalities of climate policy for that reason. So having said that, there are a few key concepts that are useful for us to get our heads around so that we can support the communities who we work with to have their voices heard in policymaking in this field. And the first here on the screen are two key terms: adaptation and mitigation. So these are central to climate policy making at every level, globally, at a European level, and nationally. Adaptation involves making changes to adapt our society to the changing climate, and taking appropriate action to prevent or minimize the damage and destruction that we face and will continue to face as a result of the changing climate. So adaptation measures involve things like flood protection, involve things like infrastructure and building design, and procedures to manage disasters, flooding, fires, and extreme weather events. In Ireland, adaptation is largely being led out by local authorities and by groups called CAROs, Climate Action Regional Offices, which group together the local authorities in regional bodies to support local adaptation measures. The second key strategy to address climate change is what's known as mitigation. So this is action to reduce our emissions and reduce the use of fossil fuels in order to stop as much as we can, that driver of climate change in the use of fossil fuels. So this includes everything from renewable energy to sustainable transport and energy efficiency. And as you can see on the slide, adaptation and mitigation measures can sometimes overlap. And so we have things like urban forestry, which are important, and trees in urban areas, which is an important step for the adaptation to climate change in particularly very hot areas that have little tree cover. The trees provide shade in urban environments and help to reduce heat in urban areas. But they also take carbon out of the atmosphere, and so they're important for mitigation. So that's just one example of how adaptation and mitigation can be combined and have co-benefits for the other. Ireland has had a national adaptation plan and a national mitigation plan um, for several years. The new climate action plan since 2021 has combined adaptation and mitigation measures. We'll talk a little bit about that in a few moments. So a second key concept for us, and we've already touched on it in the first video, if you've had a chance to watch it, is climate justice. And climate justice seeks a decent environment for all, with a fair share of the Earth's resources for everyone today and for future generations. And climate justice, as we've said in the first, spoke about in the first video, calls attention to the ways in which different groups and communities experience environmental burdens, such as pollution and fuel poverty, or enjoy environmental benefits, such as access to green space and fresh local food. And it considers the social and the political drivers and implications of climate change. So as we said in the first video, the origins of the climate crisis very much come from industrialization, from colonialism in the 19th century, and capitalist economic expansion globally. And so climate justice looks to the social inequalities and injustices, the human rights abuses that are being caused now by the climate crisis, driven by those factors, and seeks to address them. And Mary Robinson is amongst the most vocal advocate of climate justice, although the concept itself comes very much from the global south, from community movements, people's movements, trade unions, people affected by pollution and environmental injustice who have organized since the 1970s onwards. So it's rooted in the voices and the perspectives of marginalized and disadvantaged communities. Mary Robinson, though, has been very helpful in championing it at a global level, and very helpfully, her foundation summarized some of the key principles of climate justice which emerged from those grassroots movements. And that includes everything from respecting and protecting human rights, supporting the right to development, so acknowledging that the industrialized countries of the global north have had the opportunity to develop their economies and to lift their people out of poverty, largely. I mean, we still have inequality, but largely lift our people out of poverty, using fossil fuels to develop. So we know now that we need to limit and, as far as possible, eliminate the use of fossil fuels. So how do we then support those communities, those countries, particularly in the global south, who have yet to see the benefits of industrial development? And that requires things like transferring fair transfers of technology, renewable energy technology, energy efficiency technology to the global south to support those countries to develop. Sharing the benefits and the burdens equitably. So this is acknowledging that the benefits of renewables, for example, need to be shared, particularly to those countries in the global south who are still to fully develop their economies, and also recognizing that the burdens are unfairly felt on, again, those countries and communities, particularly in the south, who've done least to cause the problem, but are most vulnerable. So how do we address that? And one of the key mechanisms to do that has emerged in the last number of years, really been fought for by the global south countries in the UN negotiations, is a loss and damage mechanism. So this is a fund to support and to provide support communities that are being, feeling and experiencing the burdens and effects of climate change, and who may not even be able to adapt to it. So like the small island states in the Indian Ocean and in the Caribbean, who, if we don't keep our warming below 1.5 degrees, expect to be covered in water by the end of the century. So this is about reparations for the losses and the damages that we can no longer adapt to. ensuring decisions on climate change are participatory, transparent, and accountable. So this is a really important principle of justice, that we include people in the process of making decisions, that we ensure that everyone's voices are heard, and we remove the barriers to people being able to participate. So community workers will be familiar with, with the importance of participation and the importance of supporting wide and broad participation of all, including addressing the factors that keep people from getting to the room, let alone being heard when they get to the room. In the first video, we already have emphasized the centrality of gender equality and equity in climate justice. And again, Mary Robinson emphasizes this in her principles. We haven't spoken about the transformative power of education for climate stewardship, but this is a central principle for Mary Robinson of climate justice. So again, emphasizing the importance of sharing knowledge, supporting people to think critically and understand the issues around climate justice in order for them to be able to participate effectively, to advocate effectively, to campaign and bring about the change that they need to see in their local communities. So education, really central to climate justice and critical education. And finally, for Mary Robinson, partnerships are crucial. Given that the climate crisis is as a multifaceted crisis, a multi-level crisis that crosses many different policy areas, partnership is really crucial. Partnership in government, partnership between government and civil society, and partnership between various different groups in civil society, from community organizations to trade unions to environmentalists. No one group has the answer, and no one group will be able to address this crisis alone. And I'm delighted to be able to say that the Irish government has really taken a partnership approach to climate policy making in the last number of years. And the climate action plans that have been developed by this government since 2021 really do take a whole of government approach and really focus on the importance of partnerships to achieve the rapid and equitable action that we need to see to address the crisis. So another key principle, which is really important for us as community workers to be aware of, is the idea of just transition. And this idea emerged from the trade union movement from the 1970s, and originally wasn't specifically speaking about climate change or the climate crisis, but really focused on how to support workers' rights and workers' livelihoods in the shift away from closing industries. So in the 1970s, this was maybe in relation to petrochemicals or other manufacturing. But today, it's really become a key call for the trade union movement in the process of addressing climate change. So the unions really want to ensure that as we move away from using fossil fuels, which have been the mainstay of our energy systems and our economies for the last 200 years in the global north, how do we protect those workers whose lives and livelihoods and the communities that depend on those jobs in the process? So just transition has been recognized as a principle in the Paris Agreement of 2015 and has become a central element of both European Union policy and, as a result, Irish national policy. And we'll speak about that in more detail in a few minutes. But fundamentally, a just transition emphasizes justice and equity in climate policy making. And when we talk about equity, we mean fair share of the benefits and the burdens of the climate crisis and the solutions. And it places the rights of workers and the most marginalized front and center in the energy transition. And as you see there in the photograph from some unison trade union organizers in Northern Ireland, one of the key slogans of the unions in relation to just transition has been that there are no jobs on a dead planet. So it is really important that for everybody, including workers in these traditional polluting industries, that we move away from fossil fuels, but we do it in a way that acknowledges the dignity of the workers and protects their livelihoods. Another key concept, one in which I'm sure you're familiar with, or at least I've heard about, is sustainable development. And sustainable development emerged from conversations at a UN level from the 1970s onwards, and was really crystallized in the 1980s by the World Commission on Environment and Development, led by the woman you see there on your screen, the former Norwegian Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland. And so this commission was known as the Brundtland Commission. And it's a massive report, massive document, which the Commission produced, looking at issues of how can we balance development, particularly development in the global south, and the need for those nations to lift their people out of poverty, with the environmental planetary boundaries, planetary limitations, which were becoming increasingly apparent in the 1980s. And so the Brundtland Commission developed this definition of sustainable development, saying that it involves development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So the fundamental idea there is this, is also known as intergenerational equity, that we meet our needs in a way that doesn't prevent future generations from being able to meet their needs. And when we talk about needs, we're also thinking about protecting human rights. So a really important and fundamental concept that has become central to global policy making around the environment, around development, around human rights, and climate change and climate justice. So much so that in 2015, the UN, when replacing the Millennium Development Goals, developed the Sustainable Development Goals, which are running from 2015 to 2030. So they're central to the global policy agenda on environment and development. However, it is important to think critically about the Sustainable Development Goals and think critically about sustainable development as a concept. And many people have done that work of thinking critically and critiquing sustainable development. One of whom, who I particularly find useful and helpful, is Julian Agyeman. He's a British professor of urban planning working in a university in the US, and really centered around environmental justice work in urban planning. And he has developed the concept of just sustainability, really critiquing what he describes as the justice and equity deficit in sustainable development. And as you see there, the definition on the screen, there isn't really a strong emphasis on justice. And so Agyeman offers a definition of just sustainability, which he describes as ensuring a better quality of life for all, now and into the future. So there's that intergenerational equity piece there. But he takes it further and he says, in a just and equitable manner, while living within the limits of supporting ecosystems. So he's talking about intergenerational equity, the justice between generations, but also intra-generational equity, that we're ensuring justice and equity between people today, while also recognizing those planetary boundaries. So I find it a useful sort of update to the Brundtland Commission's definition from the 80s. So we spoke in the first session about planetary boundaries and the work of the Stockholm Resilience Institute. And as I mentioned, I think in that video, Kate Raworth takes it a little bit further, takes that framework of planetary boundaries a little bit further, and incorporates both planetary boundaries and social foundations. So what would it look like to respect the boundaries of the ecosystem while also ensuring that we balance the development needs of all? So this is that same tension and challenge that sustainable development and just sustainability is looking to manage. And so Raworth is a fantastic writer and speaker. Worked for Oxfam for years and is now has produced several books on what she calls donut economics, looking at how we can work within what she describes as the safe and just space for humanity, recognizing those planetary boundaries and social foundations. And the key challenge, according to Rawwood, is to remain within that donut space, meeting basic needs and protecting human rights without overshooting planetary boundaries. So I encourage you to take it to have a Google of Kate Rawwood's work. She's got a fantastic TED Talk which explains in more detail her concept of donut economics, and several books which are really readable and provide a. I'm not an economics expert, I'm not an economist, but I get a lot out of her work. It's very accessible and easy to engage with. So there were some key concepts to touch on and to be aware of as community workers. As I said, each of those concepts has a rich history. There are debates and different perspectives and more detail on each of them. Feel free to engage with all of that, but at a bare minimum, having a grasp of those concepts will help us in our work to support communities and support the voices of the people we work with in policy making. So let's turn now to policy making, and I'm coming to you. I'm recording this in April of 2023. Who knows when you're going to be watching this, but the policy landscape is ever evolving and changing. It's really a rapidly evolving field because for a long time there was not a huge amount of action on the climate crisis, and now as governments and international organizations ramp up their response, it's a rapidly evolving field. So at a global level, and we'll touch on these in a bit more detail in just a moment, we have the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, which provide the sort of the key touchstones of policy, and these are what have driven policy at a European, national, and local level: the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. At a European level, a number of key initiatives from 2019, which have again evolved and developed since that point, are the European Green Deal, the European Climate Pact, European Climate Law of 2020. It was made an Erasmus Plus priority, climate and environment, in 2019, and has also been integrated into a number of other European funds, Horizon 2020, for example. And we also have, in 2019, the Just Transition Mechanism. So the European Union, much like it was in the 90s with the structural funds, is very much concerned with ensuring a balance of an economic balance between the regions and between countries in the European Union. And so the Just Transition Mechanism is the EU's key finance mechanism for supporting workers in former coal mining areas, former energy, fossil fuel dependent energy industries, to reskill and support those communities to ensure that they're not left behind in the transition. In Ireland, the Just Transition Mechanism is a central funding mechanism for a huge range of initiatives that are taking place in the Midlands, as the Midlands transitions away from Bord na Móna extracting and burning peat towards other alternative forms of revenue, which include rewilding the bogs, but also pivoting towards recycling and renewable energy generation. At a national level, then, this is a rapidly evolving space, but we have a national implementation plan for the SDGs. We have a huge range of different funding streams for climate justice. We have our climate law in 2021, which is the central legislative piece of legislative framework from which has flown the climate action plan which we're on the third iteration of now. We also have the Community Climate Action Programme, which is being administered by Pobble, and you may be aware of that, or even in receipt of funding. At a local level, we've got a couple of important initiatives also. The local Agenda 21 fund emerged in the 1990s, and that was a key early source of what you might call seed funding for community groups to undertake environmental projects. It has been really overtaken and replaced by things like the Community Climate Action Programme, but I just wanted to acknowledge it here because organizations may be familiar with it or may have received funding from it. At a local level, the central focus really is around adaptation, building on that local authority competency around roads, water infrastructure, environmental planning and such like. So we have climate action regional offices, which I mentioned, which are about resourcing and supporting local authorities to do that adaptation work. We have a climate action charter, which local authorities have began to sign up to from 2019. And we have adaptation strategies, climate adaptation strategies at each local authority level. So national government really is focused on mitigation primarily and the just transition with some elements of adaptation. Local authorities are doing some amounts of mitigation, but primarily focused on adaptation. That's the sort of the way in which the work has been roughly divvied up. So just to touch on these things in a little bit more detail, at a global level, we have the Paris Agreement from 2015, emerging out of the COP process, the UN process negotiating climate agreements. And Paris sets us on course to reach what they're calling net zero emissions by 2050. So one of the problems in the past with the negotiations at a global level was it was very difficult to find a binding emissions reduction target and emissions reduction pathway that everybody was going to agree to. So the innovation of the Paris Agreement was it set out a framework for reducing emissions rather than setting out percentage goals at the outset. It was agreed in Paris that we're going to keep emissions below 1.5 degrees of warming. And this is crucial, particularly for those small island states, because anything over 1.5 degrees is going to see sea level rises, which will mean that those nations will no longer be able to exist. So for those nations, those Pacific Island and Caribbean nations, the key slogan in Paris was 1.5 to stay alive. And so as a developed industrialized nation, Ireland has has a responsibility to those small island states and to the global south to reduce our emissions in order to support that global effort to keep those nations alive. So 1.5 is the target. And to keep below 1.5, by 2050, we need to have net zero emissions. What they mean by net zero is that they acknowledge that there will still be some carbon emitted, but we'll be balancing the books through as much emissions reductions, as much mitigation as we can achieve, keeping the coal, the oil, the gas in the soil, not extracting it, ramping up renewables, ramping up energy efficiency, and then also electrifying our transport systems, retrofitting our homes, all of that. And then where there might need to be some emissions, doing what we can to offset them through biodiversity projects and planting trees, for example, to give an obvious one. So that's the net zero. It won't be gross zero. There will still be some emissions of fossil fuels and carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases, but we will reduce them to the point where we will be able to balance the books. So the Paris Agreement sets that pathway to net zero by 2050. At a global context, then, we have two key bodies that are important to be aware of. First of all, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the IPCC, as it's known, provides the consensus scientific evidence on climate change and supports governments and policymakers to make decisions. They produce what are known as assessment reports. We're on, I think, assessment report 5 or 6 now. And so every 5 years or so, since the 1980s, they've been producing these AOR reports, assessment reports, collating the consensus scientific evidence on climate change. The latest assessment report is now complete. They're saying that really this is the last assessment report that will be produced before 2030, when the next key milestone of 51% emissions reductions needs to be met. So this latest report provides us with the evidence and the data to guide us towards that point. The other key body in the global context is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this was established in 1991 at the Earth Summit in Rio, and the UNFCCC is the structure for international climate policy coordination and decision making. It's a convention, it's a legal treaty of the United Nations, signed up to by most nations in the world. And so the COP meetings are the meetings of the parties to the convention. It's the conference of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that's the global framework, and climate policy has been really driven and led from that UN level. But the EU has also played an important role. Since the 1970s, the European Union has been concerned with the protection of the environment. And as you may know, a lot of Irish environmental policy and legislation has been driven by our membership of the European Union. And Ireland for a long time has been seen as a laggard in protecting the environment because of our focus on attracting multinational companies, attracting global industrial development, and not wanting to place what the government might see as undue burden on those companies to make it more attractive for them to come here. So as a result, the environment has often suffered, and the communities that rely on that environment have suffered. But as I say, our membership of the European Union has played a really transformative role in bringing Ireland into the 21st century on environmental regulation, and in the climate space, it's no different. So the European Union is concerned with a whole range of different things when it comes to climate, and they want to be seen as a global leader on the transition. So the Green Deal concept emerged from US political discourse, but actually it was Europe that took it and ran with it and developed a European Green Deal. And since the COVID-19 pandemic, the European response to COVID has been very much linked to the Green Deal to drive both the recovery from the pandemic and drive forward the energy transition. So the policy landscape for the European Green Deal is enormous. It's affecting every single aspect of the economy across every member state of the European Union. So we don't have a huge amount of time to go into it just now, but just to suffice to say, key elements include the mitigation targets, so the emissions reduction of each member state. It also includes energy efficiency, something the European Union is very, very concerned with. How do we retrofit our homes, retrofit our businesses to make them more efficient and to prevent fuel poverty, energy poverty for citizens. We're also really concerned, as I said, with the just transition and supporting the different regions of Europe to not be left behind in the process of this transition. And another crucial area for the European Union, of course, is agricultural policy. And the common agricultural policy continues to be the framework for all member states of the EU when it comes to agriculture, and reform of the CAP to address climate concerns is an ongoing process for the European Union. At a national level, we have a legal framework which is set out by the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act, and your toolkit provides a little bit more detail on the act. So I won't go into the details here because it's sort of technical stuff which you can read about. But our policy framework is a bit more dynamic and shifting and changing. So I will just touch on some key points in relation to the Climate Action Plan, which is updated annually. So we're currently on the third iteration of that, CAP 23, and not the Common Agricultural Policy, Climate Action Plan. And so just some key terms and key terminology which will allow you to engage with this policy. And I would encourage you to go away and look at the summary. It's quite short summary of the action plan, which I think is enough for us as community workers to just be across. The actual policy or the actual plan itself is incredibly detailed. It's hundreds of pages long and deals with the finer points of each sector. So there may be some elements of that, including the citizen engagement and the just transition chapters, which will be relevant to us. But I think the summary is the main thing to be aware of. So some key concepts in relation to the policy. The first is our national climate objectives. So in line with global and European commitments, Ireland aims to be climate resilient, biodiverse rich, environmentally sustainable and climate neutral no later than 2050. This is what we're moving towards. And this requires, as you can imagine, rapid shifts and changes across all sectors of society. Now, as a community worker, this objective is, I'm fully behind it and I support it, but I am a little bit concerned about the lack of justice and a lack of an emphasis in front and center in the objective on justice and equity. So it comes back to, again, that tension that we saw in the definitions of sustainable development between an emphasis purely on sustainability and Julian Agamemnon's and Kate Raworth's bringing in of the need to consider justice, equity, human rights, and all of that in the process. So this is the first thing I think to be aware of as practitioners working with communities who are in danger of being left behind, that we need to be addressing that justice and equity deficit, or the potential for a justice and equity deficit in climate policy. Second key concept is the carbon budget. So this is the keystone measure for reducing emissions. The government, through the under climate legislation, has set a carbon budget nationally and for different sectors. And so we've got three budget periods, as we'll see in just a moment, between now and 2030 that have been set out. And beyond 2030 to 2050, we'll have additional budget periods. So the carbon budget means the total amount of emissions measured in CO2 equivalent that may be emitted by the country during a specific time period. Supporting that national carbon budget, then we have sectoral emission ceilings. So these are the total emissions permitted by each sector of the economy during a specific time period. And I'll speak a bit more about who those sectors are in just a moment. But just to put this into a timeline, from 2021 to 2025, the mitigation plan has set out a 4.8% emissions reduction target per annum. From 26 to 30, we're looking at 8.3% emissions reduction per annum. So we're ramping things up for the second half of this decade. And by 2030, we need to see a 51% reduction in emissions. That then puts us on course to remain below 1.5 and by 2050 to achieve carbon neutrality or net zero emissions. Now, all of this, if you've been following the news over the last number of years and months, is highly contentious because it involves a lot of horse trading between various different sectors of the economy to see who's going to cut things first, who's going to cut things deepest, who's going to bear the brunt of emissions reductions, and who gets, gets some slack. And there are all sorts of different reasons why all the various sectors might argue their case for not, bearing the brunt or getting some slack. So it's an incredibly contentious and highly political challenge to navigate. Again, I think for us as practitioners in community development, the key question is that justice and equity and human rights piece for the most marginalized. How are we ensuring that we meet our targets in a way that does our fair share globally, in line with global solidarity and Ireland's commitment to human rights and justice globally, while also protecting the most vulnerable and marginalised communities here in Ireland. So the sectors involved in this, we've got 6 key sectors: the energy sector, which is making the transition to renewables; the building, the residential building sector, which is identifying key measures that they can put in place to reduce the emissions from building; and concrete production is one of the most carbon intensive processes. And so how we shift the emissions from producing concrete is crucial. Travel and transport is a third key sector. So everything from public transport to private car travel. This is as I mentioned in the previous workshop, or previous video, is a particularly contentious issue. Are we looking to provide everybody with a electric car, or are we looking to vastly improve our public transport infrastructure so that not everybody needs to have a car? And I would say, as much as it would be wonderful for everyone to be able to have a car and have an electric car, really and realistically, it's public transport and ramping up public transport that needs to happen, because providing the precious metals and minerals for electric car batteries also creates a huge amount of pressure on the environment, and a new mining boom is taking place in those sectors. And again, as we saw in the last video from the image of the Setterhon coal mine, the burden of that mining, which is incredibly destructive, requiring highly toxic chemicals, including arsenic and other pollutants, falls somewhere, and very often on the poorest, most marginalized, most vulnerable communities in the global south. But also, it's become an increasing issue in Ireland. There's a massive boom in the awarding of mining licenses to companies that want to explore and extract metals from communities in Ireland, particularly in the West. And I encourage you to take a look at the work of a group called CAME, Community Action Against the Injustice of Mining, who are campaigning for a fair and just mining policy, and for communities' voices to be heard in that new resource grab. Farming then is the 4th key sector, and of course the methane emissions from cattle being a key source of Ireland's climate pollution. So how we address that while also protecting the livelihoods of family farmers is a crucial question. And again, it requires maintaining the national herd and expanding the national herd at high levels requires considering how do we offset that, and potentially makes a sacrifice zone of places like Leitrim, where huge numbers of monoculture Sitka spruce are being planted, crowding out the human community, making Leitrim unlivable for many people, and causing a lot of catalyzing a lot of community campaigning around unjust forestry policy. So again, very difficult trade-offs in all of this process. Next, we have enterprise and business, another crucial sector, of course, to reduce emissions in. And finally, land use and the marine environment. So for the Irish government, the just transition is a crucial concern, and it's great to see the government's commitment to this after a long period of inaction, a long period of dragging their heels. So the government's just transition principles are set out in the Climate Action Plan, integrated, structured, and evidence-based. So, making sure that we have the knowledge and the research to make the right decisions for the just transition, supporting communities to have the right skills. So that's that process of supporting the workers, for example, in Bord na Móna, to upskill and reskill to make them, to pivot towards the opportunities of the transition. Supporting and ensuring equitable impact, that the burden doesn't fall first and worst on the communities of the Midlands who face the loss of their livelihoods with the loss of those peak jobs. And crucially as well, social dialogue. So engaging people in communities in the discussion in proper and meaningful way around how we design our just transition policies and the particular actions that come from that. So a couple of key commitments in the Climate Action Plan around the just transition and around citizen engagement, which I think are important for us to be aware of as community workers. First of all, we have a commitment to implement that framework that the policy sets out. We have a commitment from the government to establish a Just Transition Commission to advise the government on how to carry out the transition process in the Midlands, to continue targeted work in the Midlands with €169 million of European funding for the Just Transition Fund, targeted social welfare measures to prevent fuel poverty, and a commitment from the government to ring fence carbon taxation for that purpose, and also for the purpose of supporting marginalised communities to have access to renewable energy, and then a commitment to decarbonise public and private local rural buses. In terms of citizen engagement, the state has been experimenting with citizen engagement and climate dialogue for a number of years, and a number of positive initiatives which I think could stand to be expanded and grown around climate dialogue, and a commitment here in the policy, in the action plan, to an ongoing inclusive programme of citizen and stakeholder engagement. And as community workers, I think it's really important for us to be engaged with that process and to be really clear about what an inclusive and participatory, meaningful programme of citizen engagement looks like. And again, this is an area where our expertise as practitioners really, I think, can stand to shape government policy in very positive ways. So to wrap up this second video, I'd like to invite you to consider, whether you're alone or with colleagues, what applying a climate justice thinking about a climate justice lens, which we've looked at, those principles from Mary Robinson. What are the key issues in climate policy? So if we were to apply that climate justice lens, what would stand out as the key concerns for us as community workers? So I invite you to reflect on that now. And we'll be back with the third and final video in just a few moments.